he's got a fairly extensive background in plant pathology from his previous career, and so basically Clint's going to share some key elements of how the disease infects the plants and what contributes to higher risk situations, and focus a fair amount from talking with him on timing and staging of fungicide application and how to ensure that you get good efficacy out of those products. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Clint and let him get started.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction, Derwin. I'm assuming everyone should be able to see the Sclerotinia stem rot screen, or my opening screen. Is that in already now, Derwin?
Yeah, it's up. Looks good.
Okay, great. So I just got to hide my control panel. Okay, I think I'm ready to go. Well, thank you all for joining me. I know that it's a busy time of year, and we all want to be out in the field looking at things, and I know I'm in the same boat as well. So this particular presentation, as Derwin has indicated, it's not going to be a full presentation on the disease and all the aspects of the disease. We're really coming down to a point right now that we have to make a decision as whether or not to spray our canola in order to protect it for sclerotinia. So I'm going to try to provide you with a little bit of background information so that you can make the right choice for your particular field. And the way that I like to structure my presentations now is usually to lead off with the key messages that I want you to walk away with, so that it's perfectly clear exactly what I'm trying to cover, and if you happen to walk away for a coffee and then come back, and you'd still have the opportunity to not be totally lost. So the key messages that I want you to come away with here out of this presentation is that this disease, Sclerotinia stem rot, it likes pretty much the exact same growing conditions that a high-yielding canola crop likes. So if your field looks like it's going to be a really high-yielding crop, like I'm talking better than 35 bushels, 40, 50 bushels, in that range, those are the same kind of conditions that the disease likes, and so there is a fairly good risk that your crop could have that disease express itself this year. The second key point is that the risk for widespread disease this year looks fairly high. 2010 was a very high Sclerotinia year. I think we all are pretty well aware of that. And 2011 is shaping up to be the same type of situation, and maybe even more so, just due to the fact that 2010 was such a big year. So I'll go into that in a little bit more detail as well. The key for being successful with taking a fungicide application, or making use of a fungicide application, is to make sure that you use the right rate at the right time. And we'll look at that in a little more detail as well. And then the last key point that I want you to consider is that when you are choosing your fungicides, make sure that you are planning a fungicide rotation strategy there, because these fungicides, they're like herbicides in that they can lose their efficacy for controlling the pests that they're designed for. The Sclerotinia stem rot can develop resistance to a fungicide, so we need you to consider that when making your fungicide decisions. So those are the key messages, and we'll wrap up with those at the end of this presentation. Okay, let's get started. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different tactic here in talking about Sclerotinia. I've got a series of images coming up. I want to see how good your identification skills are. Now, if you are seeing any of the Sclerotinia symptoms that I'm showing you here today, it's going to be too late. There's no way that you can make a fungicide application pay, but at the end of the season, if you know what Sclerotinia looks like, then it should make knowing whether or not you're going to have a problem the next year a lot easier. So I know that you cannot respond. Everybody is muted, so I'm going to assume that you're yelling out the answers when I show these images. So let's get started with the first one. So this first image actually is one that I had taken out of North Dakota, and the question is this one Sclerotinia? And the answer to that is no, actually this is blackleg, although many of the growers in the region at the time thought that they were dealing with sclerotinia. But it does have a lot of the same, I guess, macro or large-scale type of look. You see a lot of premature death, but this one happens to be caused by blackleg and not sclerotinia. So if you're trying to identify whether or not you have the disease at the end of the season from the seed of your truck, you could possibly confuse sclerotinia with blackleg. Second image, is this one sclerotinia? And the answer to that is no as well. This actually comes from that same field. This is blackleg and what it can look like under very severe infection. What the differences are is that blackleg, your plant still remains woody and hard. You don't get the white bleaching that you see typically with sclerotinia. So if you are trying to identify what this is without pulling up the plant, if you notice that these things are still looking woody and kind of blackened rather than white and bleached, then it's not sclerotinia. Third image, is this one sclerotinia? Now this particular disease has set in fairly early in the season and it's caused the plants to start wilting. The answer to that, no, this is not sclerotinia either. This is what clubroot will do if it infects fairly early in the season. We don't see these type of symptoms at all with sclerotinia where the plants start to wilt. If you have early infection with sclerotinia, they'll start to rot instead if you have very humid conditions. So wilting is not a symptom of sclerotinia. Fourth image, is this one sclerotinia? I could probably hear you out there yelling. The answer is yes. This is what sclerotinia can look like when you have lodging occurring in your crop. And this is one of the keys to successfully avoiding sclerotinia is having a canola variety or a crop that does not lodge, because when it lodges, you create a really humid microenvironment there that allows the fungus to grow along one particular branch. Then it'll jump, it'll due to the physical contact, will start growing amongst all the other branches and cause huge losses in that mat of lodged crops. So choosing a lodging resistant varieties is one of the keys to being successful at avoiding the disease. But you will notice that the sclerotinia, all of these infected stems have turned white and bleached color. They turn papery. They almost kind of shred or fall apart upon contact, and so that's a typical symptom of the disease. Next image, is this one sclerotinia? And the answer to that is no. Majority of this would be alternaria, and it comes in late in the season, usually pretty close to harvest time. It looks like there's also some hail damage on here, so there might even be a little bit of blackleg infection, but alternaria typically has these blackened spots along the pods and upper stems. Third image, or pardon me, sixth image, is this one sclerotinia? And the answer to that is no. And this one's a little trickier, and I apologize for that, because you do as well, this is blackleg again, and it can produce some stems that are lighter in color, but again, they're still going to be woody all the way through. But like sclerotinia, you'll have individual plants dying, and when it comes time to swathing, you'll see those premature ripened plants, and you might think that you've got sclerotinia, but it could be blackleg. Seventh image, is this one sclerotinia? The answer to that is yes. Again, very typical. White bleach, the stem loses its strength. It's no longer woody. It's papery. It falls apart quite easily. And so then you do get some lodging or stem breakage occurring. Eighth image, is this one sclerotinia? And the answer to that is yes again. Now this is a symptom that you might see very close to the end of the season when the plant is senescing or dying off. But what you may sometimes see are these growth rings. And so this is due to the fungus likes cool, moist conditions for the most part for it to express itself. But if it ever goes through like a wet, or pardon me, a dry or hotter period, it'll stop growing. And so it can produce these types of almost look like tree rings on it. So that's sclerotinia for sure. Last image, is this one sclerotinia? And the answer to that is yes, of course. Sclerotinia comes from normally infected petals that land on leaves and land on stems, and that acts as a food source for it to start growing, and again, you can sort of see these growth rings that are occurring throughout the lesion, and it'll grow very quickly under the right growing conditions, and very quickly consume that whole or rot that whole leaf. But once it gets into the stem, that's where you end up losing a lot of yield. So again, if you are seeing any of these symptoms, it's too late to enact a control measure. And so that's why we're talking to you here today, is that we are just on the very cusp of flowering throughout the prairies, and so there is still opportunity to make a control decision, and it really is going to come down to your individual field, and it's a tough decision to make, because it'd be nice if you could see the disease to know whether or not you need to make that control decision, but you have to really look at whether the conditions are conducive on your farm. So the next component that I want to talk about is the Sclerotinia the disease cycle. I'm not going to go into it in huge detail, but I want to illustrate a few of these points that are critical for your understanding as to whether or not you should take that control measure. So the disease, or the fungus, starts out its life cycle as a sclerotia during the winter and early spring months. So these sclerotia are hardened survival bodies. They're pretty hard to distinguish from soil. They can be as small as a mouse turd or as big as a thumbnail, variable in shape and size. But these survival structures can live in the soil for many years. 4 or 5 years is not uncommon. But when you have ample amounts of soil moisture in the springtime, so the typical, well, I shouldn't say typical, but the current spring that we've had, where it has been a fairly wet spring, it induces these sclerotia to start their fruiting cycle, or production of their fruiting structure, which is called an apothecia. So these apothecia, they're fairly small in size. They kind of shape like a golf tee, but they would be definitely smaller than that. So it's saturated soils that will produce or induce these sclerotia to produce apothecia. Now I should add a bit of a caveat there that waterlogged soils, where the soil is underwater for a long period of time, these sclerotia can actually start to rot. There are other fungi and bacteria that will eat them up, but I don't know of too many fields that have turned into an entire lake. So any high spots in the field could certainly have sclerotia that are surviving under extreme saturation and producing these apothecia. So once these apothecia are produced, they normally start emerging above the soil surface, very close to our flowering period, which is not a good thing. But the surface of that apothecia looks like this. It's covered with these fungal filaments filled with little spores called ascospores. Now these ascospores, they are forcibly discharged from these asci, or these filaments. So whenever there's an air pressure change or a moisture event, it induces these apothecia to start squirting out these ascospores. And they're discharged under some pretty high pressure. So these things, they will jump. They will jump 1 meter, 2 meters off of the apothecia, and once they get above the vegetation canopy, they can move in the wind. They are very small, microscopic, and can be carried by wind up to a kilometer or a couple kilometers even in distance. And so that's one of the challenges with this disease, is that your own crop rotation is not going to be the sole determinant of whether or not you'll have disease in the field. Ascospores can be blown in from your neighboring fields, and so the rotation in those neighboring fields can have a pretty large effect on the disease expression in your own field. So when these ascospores are blown in the wind, they really like to, well, they land everywhere, and if you're out in the field right now, you're probably breathing these suckers in. But they will land on flower petals, and that's the real key to this disease being successful in canola crops. These ascospores are released pretty much the same time that the crop goes into flower, and they start coating these flower petals. And these flower petals are key to the success of the disease. This disease is, this fungus is a necrotroph, meaning that it needs dead plant tissue for it to grow. So it it'll actually kill plant tissue once it's well established, and that's why it rots leaves and it rots stems. But at the beginning, these ascospores are so tiny, they have such little energy available that they can't produce that acid that causes that rot. So they require decaying plant tissue in order to survive. And so these flower petals are a great source for that decaying plant tissue. They land on these flower petals, and these flower petals then fall down into the canopy. They land on leaves, they land on stems. Particularly if you have a wet, humid canopy, these petals will stick anywhere on the plant. And if that wet, humid conditions persist, then that fungus eats up that flower petal, and it now has enough energy to start invading your plant green tissue, and then that whole rotting procedure begins. So when we are considering a fungicide, it's really, most fungicides do not have the ability to stop infection once it has penetrated leaf and stem tissue. We need to be thinking about protecting those flower petals or stopping the infection at the flower petal stage, and that's the key to being successful. So just to complete this disease cycle, so the fungus, it'll grow up the leaves and up the branches, and once they get into the stems, it's pretty much game over. Once it's infected that stem, that organ of the plant no longer can transport water and nutrients to developing seeds, and therefore your yield is lost. So when that infection is in the main stem, that's where we see the biggest yield losses, of course. And so and that is one of the reasons that we need to be thinking about fungicide applications early in the season is to prevent it from getting into that main stem as much as possible. At the end of the season, the disease induces sclerotia production, and so these are usually produced within the stem, and as that stem rots, the sclerotia are released back to the soil, and the disease is ready to continue for your next crop that grows out there. So that's how the disease works. Now you should take a look at what are the conditions that encourage the development of the disease, and if you've attended any plant pathology presentation in the past, well, it doesn't matter what disease you're talking about, they often will show this disease triangle, which basically says for a disease to occur, you need to have all three of these components working together. And so what are these components for Sclerotinia stem rot? Well, with the pathogen, we've kind of covered this already. You have to have sclerotia somewhere in the region. Ideally for the disease, if that sclerotia is in the soil, in the field that you're growing your canola crop, then that's a big risk. But those sclerotia will eventually produce ascospores, and these ascospores are the major infection agent. So for the 2011 season, this is going to be a big thing because we're coming out of 2010, which was a big Sclerotinia year. There's going to be a lot of sclerotia all across the soils, across the prairies. So there will be plenty of ascospores blowing around and moving from field to field, unfortunately. Second component that we require for a disease to occur is to have a susceptible host. So essentially all canola varieties are a host. There are a few Sclerotinia resistant varieties that are on the market. These are still hosts for the disease. They still do get infected. They are able to slow down that level of infection. So unfortunately, like any other canola variety, they still will get the disease. So any canola variety that you're growing is a potential risk for the development of this disease. Some varieties that have longer flowering periods can pose more risk. Unfortunately, you don't have that choice available now. The variety you got in the field is the variety you have, but if the variety has a longer flowering period, you can see that there's more risk associated there because more petals being produced over a longer period of time, there's more opportunities for the disease to infect it, or the pathogen to infect those petals. And as well, lodging susceptible varieties are a risk because they are producing a more conducive canopy and there's more plant-to-plant contact, so the disease grows through them and is usually much worse in any varieties that are lodged. So those are the conditions of the host that encourage the disease. Now, it's the environmental conditions that really encourage this disease. I think even in dry years we can assume that there's probably going to be some of the pathogen around. There's always going to be a lot of canola around. It's the environment that really tells us whether or not we have that disease, and that's why you're probably here today, is to try to assess whether or not your particular environment in your particular field is going to be one that's conducive to the development of the disease. Sclerotinia, or the fungus, it loves wet conditions. It requires wet conditions to initiate that apothecia production. So early spring moisture is ideal for that, which is what we mainly have this year. It likes wet conditions at flowering period. So that fungus requires a lot of moisture to grow and to invade plant tissue. And so high humidity, wet conditions in your crop canopy will be a threat, I guess, to that development of the disease. In terms of temperature, the ideal growing temperatures for this disease are between 15 and 25 degrees C. So you might be thinking, well, we're kind of into a warmer period now. We've got high 20s, maybe even 30s in some parts of the prairies right now. Well, that should stop the disease. That should reduce the risk. Unfortunately, well, you're partly right. Temperatures above 30 degrees, the disease really slows down. It doesn't grow very much. But that's only part of the day, right? You have the evenings where the temperatures could drop back below 25 degrees, and then it's back into that growth period. And so it's those types of conditions where you see those growth rings appear. So long, well, pretty much during our flowering period, we're going to have these temperatures. And so temperature is not going to be really a way of reducing disease infection. It really comes down to moisture. And as well, I have here conducive canola canopy. If you have a canola crop that looks like it's high, it's going to be high yielding. It's not being shorted for any nutrients. It has all of the fertility that it requires. It looks like it's going to be a 40 or 50 bushel crop. Well, that canopy is going to be nice and wet and shaded under most normal conditions. That canopy as well can help moderate any of the more extreme air temperatures and keep that canopy wet. So unfortunately, once we are chasing those higher yields, we are creating that kind of microenvironment underneath the canopy that'll encourage the disease development. So that's the risk with the particular environment. So let's take a look at how this disease has expressed itself over the past just about 15 years here. So this particular chart, it shows the percentage of infected plants across the three prairie provinces of where that have been recorded during the annual disease survey. So if we go to 2010 here, Alberta is the green triangle, Saskatchewan is this pink line, and Manitoba is the blue line. You can see that in 2010 was a pretty high infection year for sclerotinia. But you also may notice that it's the amount of disease is pretty up and down. If we take a look at Saskatchewan in particular during the early part of the 2000s, those are the drought years, essentially no sclerotinia infection at all. So it's really the amount of moisture that we have available is the major determinant whether this disease is going to express itself. So what is the risk for 2011? Well, we're probably going to be up here again as well, just because we are coming as well out of a wet season, so there's going to be lots of ascospores being produced this year, and it looks like it's going to be wet again this year, so likely there is going to be a pretty severe amount of disease. Now you might be thinking, okay, so we had a lot of infected plants. What does that actually mean in terms of yield? Well, the general rule of thumb is that you just cut your infection in half, and that's the amount of yield that has been lost. So Saskatchewan, as an example, had 20% infection last year. So that's across the board, across the entire province, we've lost about 10% yield. So what does that mean for your own individual farm? Well, if you had 20% infection, that's 10% yield. So maybe if you had a 40 bushel crop, well, you lost 4 bushels as a result of that. And at today's prices, that's a pretty significant loss. So you may be thinking 20% infection, it's not all that much. I can handle a bit of that, but well, it depends on what your yield potential is for your particular field, whether or not it's going to be economical for you to make that decision. So how do we assess the risk, I guess, is the next question for your own individual field. We know that there's going to be a widespread risk across the prairies. What is going to be the risk for your own individual field? Well, there are some tools that are available for you, and the Sclerotinia stem rot checklist. This is one that is utilized by the Canola Council. It can help you make that decision whether to spray or not to spray. And so there's a number of factors that can assist you in making that decision. So one of the factors is looking at your rotation. How long has it been since you had a canola crop on that particular field? Or even better would be to consider whether or not you had any legume on that field that had a level of infection. We know that lentils last year, as an example, had some pretty high levels of sclerotinia, and it's the same fungus that infects the legume crops that infects canola. So the number of years since you had a susceptible crop will tell you how much risk you have. What was that disease incidence in that last host crop that you had, so the last canola crop that you had on that field? How much infection did you have? If it was high, then you give yourself a high risk point. What is the crop density, so your yield potential essentially? If you have high crop density, then it increases your risk. How much rain have you had in the last 2 weeks? So these rainfall events are what's going to be inducing that ascospore production. If you had a lot of rain in the last few weeks, then that increases your risk. What is the weather forecast going ahead as you're coming into the flowering period? If you're having low pressure systems that are around, which has been the case for the last while, then that certainly increases your risk as well. And then this is a little more challenging number to get, but if you have agronomists in the area that are scouting for apothecia, the greater the amount of apothecia that are out there, the greater the risk. But I think given this year, coming out of a wet year, a big sclerotinia year last year, there's going to be plenty of apothecia around. So I would say that in general we should be choosing the high numbers of apothecia. So you add up your points that you assign to your risk, and if you have a number that's greater than 40, then essentially then you're saying that you should be making that spray decision. Okay, so the next little bit I want to talk more particularly about control measures for making sure that we can keep that sclerotinia down in our particular fields. So there's a number of different ways that we can control sclerotinia. So you could be growing a resistant variety. You could be using some agronomic or cultural control measures, such as going with wider row spacings, making sure that you don't have a lodging crop. Cutting your fertility rate is a good way of cutting the amount of disease. But basically, your cultural control measures are going to be the same measures that you'll take to make sure you have a low yielding crop. So if you're doing things and trying to make decisions that you want a low yielding crop, then you shouldn't have to worry about the disease. There's also a biological control product that is available on the market that you spread over the soil that will eat up the sclerotia. But all of these things are decisions that had to have been made prior to you really planting the crop. And so if you haven't done these things, then we're left with one alternative, and that's why we're here today, is to decide whether we should or should not apply a fungicide. Fortunately for this disease, there are quite a few fungicide products that are available. We've got 6 different products that have very good efficacy on controlling this disease from most of the major chemical manufacturers. So these it's actually 5 fungicides and then one biological product. It's a bacteria that's antagonistic to the fungus. So it works a lot like a fungicide. You apply it like a fungicide. So that's why it's included in this list here. So all of these products, fortunately for us, are also in different fungicide groups, and that's a good thing actually, because the fungus, the Sclerotinia sclerotiorum, can evolve to become resistant against one particular fungicide, and we did see that a number of years ago. If you remember the product Benlate, there were certainly some reports that are coming in late in that product's life cycle that the fungus had become resistant to it. So if we use any one of these products a lot in our rotation, then there is a risk that they could become resistant to it. So simply by choosing a different product than you normally would in your crop rotation will reduce the risk of that fungus developing resistance to it. So that's a good news item. The other component about all these fungicides is when they require you to apply them. And it's all basically between that 20 and 50% bloom. And that's really important to being successful with controlling this disease. If you are on the early side or on the late side, it's going to be questionable whether or not you're going to get sufficient control. So make sure that when you have chosen your product that you do follow that label recommendation for that crop staging. So that 20 to 30% bloom stage is really critical. And I'll talk a little bit more about that bloom staging here in a little bit. Your rates for all of these products are set so that they do give you good efficacy. So make sure that you aren't shorting or going on the short side of any of these rates. If you do decide that you need to apply a fungicide, make sure that you are doing the label rate because it's costing you money to even make that effort. So make sure that you are doing it correctly. Some of these products, they do have a range in the rate that you can apply. It really comes down to what you think the risk is and what the value of your crop is. If you are chasing like a high-end yielding crop, 60 bushels or more, maybe you should be considering the higher rate just because that'll give you better insurance to make sure that you are reducing that disease. All of these products do require some fairly high water volumes, and the reason for that is because we are coating those flower petals with fungicide, or in this case, a bacteria. The better coverage you have over those flower petals, the better the activity is going to be, and the better your control is. So, again, these are all the recommendations for ground rates. Don't skimp on the water volumes. A number of the products as well do have split applications available to them, and this may be important, and it kind of depends upon your conditions and how long you think your flowering period is going to be. So if you have a crop that maybe is not non-uniform, you have a lot of variability in terms of maturity, maybe you might want to be thinking about a product where you can use a split application, just because the fungicide, all of these fungicides mainly work in terms of contact on the flower petals. So the better coating that you get over those flower petals will give you the better efficacy. But they're only coating the flower petals that are open. So if you are spraying say at the 30% bloom stage, it's only those 30% of the flowers that are actually open are going to have that fungicide on it, and that activity is only going to last as long as those flower petals are out. The 70% of the flower petals that come later, they won't be covered with that fungicide. So if you do have a crop where you think your flowering period is going to last a long time, I guess the long and short of it is that you should be probably looking at a product where you can use a split application. So those are the fungicides in a nutshell, and the keys I think are pretty evident for having a successful control. Make sure that you are staging your crop correctly. Don't be spraying at 10% bloom or at 60% bloom. Make sure that you are fairly accurate at identifying your 20 to 50% bloom staging. Make sure you are going in with the recommended rate, and make sure you are using the appropriate water volumes to get the coverage that is required. So bloom staging. How do we know when we've got 20% bloom? It's fairly, actually identifying these, it requires you to get out of the seat of the truck or get off your spray rig and walk into the field. You need to be counting the number of flowers that are open. For 20% bloom, you're looking at about 15 flowers that are open on the main raceme or the main flowering branch, your first flowering branch. So again, you're looking at about 15 open flowers. You will not see any of these petals will have dropped at this stage. So on an individual plant, you might find, okay, this plant has 15, but you go to the next plant and it might be 10, and you go to the next plant and it might be 18. You want to take that average over your entire crop. If the average comes into around 15 flowers that are open, then you're at that 20% bloom stage. So 20% bloom stage is on the earlier side for control. Probably the ideal time, if you can get this timing, is that 30% bloom stage. 30% bloom is when you have about 18 to 20 flowers that are now open on the main raceme. And again, you might have your side branches just starting out. You will not have any flower petals that have dropped at this stage yet. And so that's pretty key, because you do want to coat these petals while they are still attached to the flower. Once those petals, if they have ascospores on, they land lower in the canopy, then they are going to be a lot more difficult to control. Some fungicides do have a bit of activity where they do penetrate green stem tissue and can eradicate the disease there, but overall the best protection comes at coating these flower petals as much as possible. So this is the stage, if you have that opportunity to get, is the one to target as much as possible. 50% bloom is at the late end of the recommended rates for the fungicides. You will now have a bit of pods starting to form. You will have a couple of flowers that will have shed their petals. You're looking at least 20 flowers that are still open on the main raceme, but you will have some flowers as well that are starting to open on the side branches as well. So this is when you will just start to have some of those flowers beginning to shed their petals. So this is getting into the late stages. So the questions are, well, how early is too early to go? Now, I've said this quite a few times, that the key is to coat those early flower petals. And why is it that we want to coat the early petals? The reason is that those are your biggest risk, are those first flower petals. If those ascospores land on those flower petals land in the crop canopy, where are they going to go? Well, they're going to fall fairly far down that canopy, down to the lower leaves, down to the lower branches. So it's those first flower petals that will have the greatest risk for yield loss, because they are going to be getting closer to that main, your main stem. And once that main stem is infected, well, then it's pretty much game over for that plant, and that plant may not produce any yield at all. So preventing that early phase of infection is fairly key. But how early is too early? Well, if you are targeting stages before that 20% bloom, you're not going to be covering very many flower petals, and therefore you're essentially wasting a lot of your fungicide opportunity. So really try to get that 20 to 30%. It will be your ideal timing. How late is too late? Well, it's really becomes too late once you get past that 50% bloom stage. Again, because most of the fungicides don't have an eradicant type of activity where they can go through the plant and remove the fungus. Getting it before that 50% is really key. So, but if you are deciding on using a split application, well, then that becomes almost the art of deciding how late is too late. If you do your first application at 30% and you're deciding on your second application, you have a non-uniform crop. You might have differences in maturity of up to a week or so. Well, then maybe that 60% bloom might be the better stage, because you might have some plants that are still at a fairly early stage. So that's one good way of trying to extend that window of activity. Now, you might be thinking, well, if I spray at 30% bloom, that's still 70% of the flower petals are going to come. Why don't I spray later and try getting the bulk of the flower petals? And the reason for that is because those later flower petals are not as great a risk. Where if you are spraying at the 70% bloom, where are that last 70% actually going to fall? By the time that they start falling, the crop has grown a considerable amount. It's now tall and lanky. It's got a lot of branches on it. So usually if those flower petals are going to stick anywhere, they don't go down into the canopy very far. They just stick mainly to the upper branches, and maybe just to some of the top pods. And so those late infections, or those late petals, really are only going to cost, I guess, less loss just because they're only going to affect some of the side branches and upper pods. So it's getting that early flush of petals is really the key to avoiding the disease as much as possible. Okay, so I guess that's really the whole question is whether, how do we know if we should spray? So we went through the checklist, and if you really want to take it down to its basics, how do we know if we should be spraying in 2011? Well, we've had a wet early June, so there's lots of apothecia going to be produced and astrospores being produced. If you have a high-yielding crops that are better than 35 bushels, you can think of it as yield insurance by deciding whether to spray or not to spray. And if you're walking through your crop when you're checking the flowering stage and your plants are getting awfully wet, it's probably a good idea that you will need to protect that crop. So just to wrap things up, back to the key messages. I hope that I was fairly clear on this, that this disease likes the same conditions that your crop likes. So unfortunately, if you're expecting a high-yielding crop, you could expect that there's going to be high levels of disease. The risk for widespread disease is going to be high in 2011. Make sure you are choosing the right rate, the right crop staging, the right water volume, and rotate those fungicides. And hopefully by this, well, in the next month, we will not be seeing any of these leaf lesions, and a little bit later on, we won't be seeing any of these stem lesions. And good luck in growing your crop, and hopefully you're going to be very profitable this year. That's all I have, Derwin. I hope I haven't been gone over time. I think we've got some opportunities for questions now.
Yeah, very good, Clint. We've run over a little bit, but there's a handful of questions here, and they're pretty good ones, so I think we'll move into that. I'm just going to switch things over to me and put the sorry about that. Started over at the beginning. There we go. I'll put up the screen in the background, and we'll deal with a few of these questions. One question that came up early on was if you notice sclerotinia on the leaves when you were talking about looking at the symptoms there, Clint. This was a question from Adrian. If you see the symptoms on the leaves but not the stems yet, is it still too late to spray a fungicide?
Yeah, most of the fungicides, they don't have the activity really to penetrate that leaf tissue and to stop it. The fungus is, once it's in the leaf, is extremely aggressive. It produces an acid called oxalic acid that basically fogs all the surrounding green material within the plant and just kills it. So for a fungicide to be able to have good efficacy on that, you would need some extremely high rates. And it's often, at that point, it's, well, the fungicides just are not designed really to be able to eradicate that level of disease. If the infection is just very small, like almost a pinpoint, then most of the fungicides can stop it at that point. But once it becomes a large lesion, you're pretty much game over. Unless you want to do like some of the Chinese farmers do, where they go through their crops and pluck leaves off to remove the risk of the disease.
Okay, great. The next question was from Norm, and it was a bit regionally specific, but basically the question was because things are earlier than normal up in the Peace region, and the saturated conditions are kind of ending right now, is it possible the apothecia are not releasing spores yet and the plants won't get infected during bloom?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And, you know, I would hate to say that no, there is no risk, because we are dealing with a biological organism. There's a lot of diversity in the fungus in how it carries out its life cycle. There's some strains of the fungus that can produce apothecia when you have the right moisture conditions. That can produce an apothecia within a week or two, and there's some that will take a month or two to produce the apothecia. So really, if you've had a significant amount of soil moisture and that soil moisture has lasted for a couple of weeks, you're going to have a lot of ascospores blowing around in the wind, whether we expect it or not, unfortunately. So I think if you've had that spring moisture here, the early season moisture, and your crop is still wet now, like when you are checking your flowering stage and your canopy is still wet, then there is a pretty significant risk that you are going to see the disease. And as an example of that, and I've used this before in the past, I can think back to 2004 in northwestern Saskatchewan. Came out of 3 years of drought, and in fact a lot of the locals would say that part of Saskatchewan had been under a drought for 10 years. And I remember in 2004 some growers asking me, well, what is the risk of sclerotinia? And this was a really good moisture year. I was saying, well, you know, we haven't had any real good growing conditions for the disease for like 10 years. I'd say the risk is very low. And that was the wrong recommendation to make, because if you got the moisture this year and you got the right crop canopy, you just have to assume that there's going to be ascospores around and it's going to express itself in the disease. 2004 turned out to be a big sclerotinia year as well, coming out of many years of drought.
Good. Thanks for that, Clint. The next question was fairly straightforward. Is mustard a host? And that's from Jean-Claude.
Yeah, this disease will affect anything that is not a grass. Like maybe I should have explained that a little more in the early part of the presentation. This disease will attack anything that's got a broadleaf, and unfortunately, mustard varieties are part of that. There might be a little bit of physiological resistance in it. It might slow down the disease, like our new resistant canola varieties, but they still are hosts and they still do get infected. And if the conditions are right and it looks like a high-yielding crop, if you are growing a mustard variety, then it probably will need a fungicide protection as well.
Great. And the last couple of questions I'll maybe put together. They're from Neil and Jean-Claude as well. The first was, has there been any fungicide applications yet? And when will the earliest crops be hitting that critical 30% bloom stage? And then the second question was kind of related to that second pass and to spray or not spray. So kind of a question, I guess, also around what's the potential for that long bloom period this year?
Yeah, good questions. On Monday, I live in Lloydminster on the Saskatchewan side, and I drove down to Swift Current and back on last Monday. And so I got a bit of a cross-section of how the crop is doing from north to south in this region. And there were some fields that I did pass, particularly further south, that are approaching the 20% bloom. So there are a few crops that are getting towards that ideal spray date now. But it is still early. I have not heard of anybody pulling the trigger just yet on making a fungicide application. But I imagine that there will be quite a few guys that will be doing it. I know I will be doing it on my farm this year, unlike last year. But the question about whether or not it's likely that we'll have those longer bloom stages, it really depends upon, I think, the variability of your crop. There are some varietal differences. There are some varieties that flower for a longer period. I can't tell you which ones those are exactly. You might be able to approach your seed supplier and ask that. Maybe they would have a bit of information. But what you should know is whether or not your crop is variable or non-uniform in terms of its maturity. You have some plants that are just entering bloom stage, and you have other plants that are still at the four-leaf stage due to variable emergence. Then you might expect that there's going to be a longer flowering period in that crop. And so that it really comes down to what you think the yield potential is and what the value of protecting that yield is, whether or not you decide to use one application or two applications. But that first application is your really critical one, so I would suggest try timing that one as best as you can.
Great. Well, I think in the interest of time, we'll maybe wrap things up there, Clint. But thanks again for pulling this together on short notice. I think he gave us a really good rundown on the disease and the potential risk as we come into the flowering period this year.